and welcome to the second of two webinars brought to you by the Industry Partnership of Intelligent Buildings and TEKsystems Global Services. My name is Matt Close, and I'm the Vice President at Intelligent Buildings, and I'll be your host today for our discussion. Intelligent Buildings is the leading solely focused smart building and managed services company, and TEKsystems Global Services is a leading IT services provider specializing in 8 core practice areas. TEKsystems and Intelligent Buildings formed this exclusive partnership to bring our expertise to you all at scale for large real estate portfolios. Today, we'll be reviewing the best practices for assessing your buildings and what you can do to mitigate and understand the risk inherent in today's building systems environment. But before we get started, there's a tiny bit of housekeeping. As we progress in our discussion today, please feel free to send us your questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We'll have time allocated at the end of the webinar to address your questions. And if for any reason we don't get to everybody's questions, we'll make sure we follow up with you directly via email after we're done today. Before we go any farther, I'd like to introduce our panel. As in part one of our webinar series, we're very lucky to be joined today by our 3 industry experts that were here with us last time. And today we have an additional expert for our panel. First, I'd like to welcome back Matt Ehrlich. Matt's the director of the Smart Building Service Practice and the IoT practice at TEKsystems Global Services. Matt, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Next, I'd like to welcome back Fred Gordy. Fred's the Director of Cybersecurity at Intelligent Buildings. As I pointed out in part one, if you're involved in building systems at all, I'd recommend you give Fred a follow on LinkedIn. We're also glad to have Tom Shirkliff back. Tom's one of our principals and co-founder of Intelligent Buildings. Tom, welcome.
Thanks, Matt.
And our new panelist today is Daryl Benson. Daryl's my partner in crime here at Intelligent Buildings. He's the Executive Vice President of IB, and I can guarantee he's an awesome addition to the panel today. We're set up for a great conversation. Is everybody ready to jump on in?
Yep, ready to go.
Perfect. Because this is part 2 of a 2-part series, I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes just kind of reviewing what we recapped last time, just so for those that are brand new. We focused last time on the current state of affairs and kind of how we got here in our building portfolios. And we got there because building systems are based on open protocols, and this was in response to getting all of those things that are network connected and being able to play nice with each other, so we could run those buildings. And with this focus on getting things connected and running, there really hasn't been a focus in these systems for enterprise level cybersecurity at all, really. And with the advent of all these connected and web-enabled interfaces, this has brought on a whole new dimension in access and security. So lastly, many organizations have really relied on third parties for this primary control and management of these systems. And that's really kind of opened up a whole new organizational problem, which is vendor risk management. So, next, as IT organizations have fought back really against the hacking and hardened their networks, and as we know, water kind of runs downhill, and the focus of the hackers has started to include operational networks. Fred recently shared that we've seen at least a 400% increase in OT hacking incidents, and we only anticipate that to continue to grow. And as we discussed, oftentimes the priorities of IT organizations and OT organizations can be a little bit different. IT is first focused on confidentiality, then integrity, then availability, while with OT networks, obviously availability is king. And so we discussed that and kind of worked through how we work in that environment. But then we really started thinking about, so how do we get started to do something about this as we go forward? And there's kind of 5 steps that Matt Ehrlich outlined for us. And then first and foremost is understanding your current state. And what do you have in your buildings and what are your vulnerabilities? Secondly, you need to really think about how's that third-party ecosystem of contractors, how's it set up, and is it configured properly? And part of that is agreeing and setting the right policies and procedures. And then once you figure out what's going on, you need to remediate that risks that are found in the technology policy and procedures. And then lastly, after you get it all set correctly and monitor, you need to monitor and make sure your organization kind of stays on track. But the feedback that we overwhelmingly got, and so I kind of tongue-in-cheek say back by popular demand, was how do you focus on that first step? How do you do that inventory and assessment? So that's kind of where we're gonna focus today. And with that in mind, Tom, IB has been helping our customers with this step for a while now. Can you share with us how both Intelligent Buildings and Tech have been working with our customers on kind of assessing their buildings and kind of multiple different industries?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's funny how this thing got started for us and partner on this is there were several very large customers who in financial services and healthcare and other and technology that were doing an entire company cybersecurity review. And that was, anything that was any networkable device. And what they came to realize was, in addition to information technology or fintech, financial technology, or even clinical technology, they had this whole area of many, in some cases, thousands of connected devices related just to building systems like HVAC, elevator, lighting, parking, etc. And so they really facilities cybersecurity became an entire category by itself, and it really needed that combined skill set. So we've done now approaching thousands of sites this way because it became apparent, and again, whether it's healthcare or financial services or technology companies, that facilities cybersecurity was its own category.
Absolutely, absolutely. So Tom, as we've kind of worked with across those thousands of sites, as you mentioned, what have we learned that should be considered when you're kind of developing that assessment program?
Yeah, I think that there's it takes a combination of a few things. We've, studied this for a couple of years as management consultants looking at the problem, with these large customers is that, that experience you see on the left side there really means that you've got to know both the IT issues because these building systems are little networks and they are connected to the internet. You've also got to understand the control systems, the contractors, sort of the real estate environment and culture, and the dirty fingernails aspect of it. You have to know both. You're not really. The second thing we realized was in doing this, you really have to have a tool for this purpose. I mean, we would have been happy to use other things that we ended up didn't work. Project management tools, work order management tools, asset management tools, spreadsheets. Nothing really looked at the problem like it actually was, and it was a really big complex problem. So that was important. And then finally, we realized it had to be scaled because if you have a portfolio of buildings and only two of them are out of service or life safety issues or worse, if two out of 100 have a problem, that's a big problem. So we had to touch and get information and address every building. And the other thing about scale that was important was it had to be cost effective, affordable, basically. So we worked really hard on how the knowledge, the tools, and touching every site became affordable. And that's what scale was, not just getting to every building, which is important, getting there cost effectively.
Yeah, I was recently just at an industry event and was able to listen to quite a few senior facilities officers from Fortune 100 companies speak, and many of them talked about the fact that they're managing these large portfolios and it only takes an incident at one of the buildings.
Yeah, the best situation here is there's no news, and it only takes one system and one building to create either again a risk, a physical risk, or a productivity risk, or an insurance problem, or capital equipment damage, and wow, that's all people remember. So yeah, we have to touch every building, every system.
We have hundreds of buildings. It only happened in one excuse doesn't necessarily work. Yeah. Hey, Daryl, Tom spoke to the experience, and most likely many people on the call today have some sort of local IT organization that they've worked with in the past to do, and I'll put in air quotes, IT style assessments. Are those good enough for this problem?
Well, that's a good question. There's a big difference between IT and OT, as most people know, because business as usual over the past 15 to 20 years in the OT space has really resulted in a large percentage of the OT systems and those network environments really being designed and implemented within a construction and renovation model. And that means that we're a lot more vendor dependent in a typical installation or renovation. On the other hand, IT over the past 15 years has developed some very specific tools and practices that are purpose built for an IT or enterprise environment. Those differences between IT and OT are significant, and what IT isn't looking for, they typically don't find or have a way to mitigate the risks over the IT environment. So the requirement the requirements or risks that are inherited in most OT system deployments aren't typically found in an IT assessment, focused assessment. And OT focused cybersecurity practices and policies are also typically lacking and put organizations at risk because they are not as mature and robust as their IT counterparts. We found that using a NIST-based scoring system to assist in steering and creating a mitigation plan and execution really needs to become the norm. And as Tom mentioned, and the ability to scale that NIST-based scoring system and process across a portfolio is paramount.
Awesome. And so Daryl, if I'm looking at this slide, the typical IT assessment is going to focus on those things you talked about, those purpose-built tools focus upon. And that's the green boxes at the top. And then in an OT assessment, it would be everything we need to do down that left-hand column.
Correct. Yeah. So what you're looking at across the OT environment, as I said, is what IT isn't looking for, they don't find, right? So there's a lot of information and interaction between the systems and the vendor methodology and contracting process that typically go overlooked in an IT focused assessment process.
Got it. That makes all the sense in the world. Hey, Fred, one of the things Daryl talked about there, kind of one of the last things on the list there is the NIST-based cyber score. For those that aren't familiar or have been overwhelmed by really NIST in the past, can you talk about how we've worked with it to develop that cyber score?
Thank you, Matt. Absolutely. So NIST, for those that don't know, stands for the National Institute of Standards and Technologies. NIST Cybersecurity Framework was chartered in 2003 through an executive order and released to the public in 2014. It's currently accepted in 30 plus countries. Its use in the private sector is voluntary but mandatory for all U.S. federal agencies. Simply put, the NIST Cybersecurity Framework is a set of best practices, standards, recommendations that help an organization improve its cybersecurity measures. The NIST Cybersecurity Framework uses several recognized sources: ISO 27001, COBIT, ANSI, ISA, CCS, CSC, and of course NIST. The NIST reference in the Cybersecurity Framework points to a document, SP 853. 853 provides a catalog which is comprised of a controls list that totals 1,682. These are divided into 19 control families that support the development of secure and resilient systems. 853 introduces the concept of security control baselines as a starting point for the security control selection process. The key statement is a starting point. When starting a cybersecurity program, it's important to realize an organization cannot get to all of these at one time. There has to be a vetting process to determine where to begin. To do this, NIST developed the Cybersecurity Framework. The NIST Cybersecurity Framework core is made up of 5 functions, which are shown in the image on the screen. They are identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. Under these 5 functions are a total of 23 categories. Under the 23 categories are a total of 106 categories.
It's a bit complex, Fred.
Yeah, it's a lot to digest, especially if you're new to cybersecurity and trying to wade through all the guidances and policies that are out there. So what we've done is we've taken this complex list of controls and boiled them down to 21 policy focus areas. All of these are directly mapped to multiple NIST categories. To further simplify the process, we've divided the 21 policy focus areas into 3 groups of 7. The first group of 7 is the foundational policy areas. In this group are policies that can either be adopted with low, medium effort, or policies that focus on risks that should be addressed as soon as possible. For example, continuity. Continuity documents the recovery process, the roles and responsibilities, planning for disaster, backup processes and standards, and the verifications of successful recovery. Given that ransomware is by far the most prevalent attack seen today on control systems, continuity should be top priority for any organization. The next 2 groups are as important as the first 7, but may require a phased-in approach over time. The speed at which these are adopted can also depend on the OT cyber maturity of the company. And one last thing, I'm often asked where to start. Notice the first function in NIST is identify. That is where you need to start. You can't protect what you don't know you have, so taking an inventory of what you have and maintaining an inventory is a definite first step. You need to identify policy and procedure around your vendors to manage risk, and you need to identify your risk tolerance of your OT systems.
And so, Fred, I mean, that's kind of coming back to the essence of what we're talking about today. So when you say I identify, is that kind of what we're talking about from an assessment perspective? You got to get in there and understand what networks you have and then what's on those networks?
Absolutely. I mean, that is key and paramount to any beginning steps to a successful cybersecurity program.
And that's where we're talking about being able to scale out and do that across all of your buildings. So Matt, I mean, that's where the stunning expertise of TEKsystems really comes into this partnership and being able to help people go out to their entire portfolios. You want to kind of talk to how we've addressed being able to get to that scale and help people go across their entire portfolios?
Yeah, sure. So Tom mentioned the experience and the tools and the scale, and it's one of the scenarios where you really do need all three. One of the fascinating aspects of this, and really in this industry, is you look across these mega industries like financial services and retail, healthcare and government, hospitality, utilities, all these mega industries that have a ton of multi-use buildings in a ton of different locations, and scale is really a difficult piece of it. So then the question is, how do you execute and how do you scale? First things first, as an organization, you have to have the people. So one option, if you're a leader, you could have your local teams at all your local sites across the country or the world do the work. But I think for this topic, we got to ask ourselves, is that a realistic expectation? Do you have the right talent? Do you have the right folks local? And if not, you probably need to build some sort of SWAT team, which is going to be really, really expensive, generally speaking, from a travel perspective. And it's likely that those people are, serving a different role in your organization today, and you'd be pulling them away from something else that they're currently doing. So that's where we've been able to apply our model. Our model is we've over 150 physical locations with consultants, essentially 40,000 employees across these locations. And so we're able to locally serve buildings. For example, one of the banks that we did, we served 9,000 sites in a matter of 12 weeks. And so the scale exists because we have that local touch and that local reach to get qualified people in the door and work with the various constituents. The second component, if you're thinking about this, from a scale perspective, is you have to have a coordinated approach. And I look at these large, whether it's assessments, inventories, remediations, whatever it might be, these are potentially more complex than your traditional deployment, whether that's an IT, OT, or any other type of deployment. So our service delivery organization, with the help of IB, has been able to do some characterization of different building types, and that enables much more predictable timelines and a coordinated approach to delivery. And as Tom mentioned, we also have some tools in place that enable us to automate part of the process. So I think it's really twofold for scale. It's access to the people, and the second piece is the mature process to actually manage the effort. As many people on this call probably know, the bigger and more complex, the harder it is to actually execute and scale.
Yeah, it is kind of scary. I mean, when you just said that 9,000 sites over 12 weeks, just did the quick math backwards on a 5-day work week, assuming you were working 5 days, you all were in 150 sites a day. That's
Yeah.
kind of hard to figure out how you would do that if you didn't have a distributed team being able to address it. So.
And sure, and it's probably not something that a general organization is capable of. And to the earlier point that Tom was referring to, if you did 7,000 of them, you get a pat on the back, but it doesn't really help. You got to do all of them, and that's where really having that type of coverage is key.
Yeah, and if you're doing that 150 sites a day, that's a lot of data. That's a lot of inputs. That's you got to keep track of that and understand. So, you don't necessarily want 150 spreadsheets coming in. Tom, can you? We've been doing this, and you're involved in that project with tech and helping with all that data. Can you talk a little bit about the the approach and the tools that are kind of necessary to be able to deal with that and make sure it's extremely actionable. Because data is one thing, but you want insights from that data.
Yeah, sure. And Matt did a good job talking about, how in the world do you cover lots of sites cost effectively, and now the audience can see that, but it's not easy. Now, having said that, it isn't easy, but what we're doing is actually pretty simple. If you just look at this list here, I'll just touch on it briefly, and why we think the power of the knowledge and experience and the tools and sort of that scale, the cost effectiveness. I mean, most of our customers, even the very sophisticated customers, don't always know even what is exactly in the buildings with the control systems, who manufactured it, who maintains it, how it's configured, what software version, and then that's the asset, kind of list, and then the access is like who. Who out of these dozens or hundreds, in some cases thousands of systems, who has access to those? Who's got a record of who accessed them? What levels of permissions, admin users, super users? And it sounds like an obvious question, but have those systems been backed up maybe ever? Much less in the past quarter or 6 months or so forth. So the other thing is, very importantly, like we talked about early on for these customers that were doing full-blown cybersecurity reviews, every one of these building control systems is a network. That's just how they work. It's not a smart building thing. They're just made that way since the 80s. They have servers and software and protocols and digital controllers, and they're internet connectable. How are they connected? Network or their rogue DSL lines and all this kind of stuff. So those are all pretty simple concepts. It's just that you're having to do it for 2 or 3 or 10 or 15 systems in every building that you have. And then the final thing there is not to worry about immediately when we're helping with an inventory assessment. But as I just mentioned, every one of your building control systems is a network. So at some point after we've done some blocking and tackling on these first 4 lines, those little networks are going to move into proper process and controls approach, just like your enterprise IT. So we just wanted everybody to know that we're thinking a little bit ahead after we block and tackle how this will ease into sort of a traditional IT audit process.
And I think that's, thinking about the future today, because that's kind of how we've gotten to this point now. Because as we were working and getting all these buildings connected, I'm not sure there was a big vision to the future of, how are we in the now working in an environment where people are trying to break in. So we're trying to anticipate that future a little bit in the audit trail going forward.
Just a quick note, Matt, on that when you said, and that's very important. The things on this list, at least the first 3, for example, are really about not as much about who can get in bad from the outside, but what bad can happen on the inside. If I've got 2-year-old software and poorly connected things internally, and too many super users and all these there's an operational risk going on with all the complexity on the inside, not just the hackers.
Absolutely. So Daryl, we have the tool, we've done the assessments, we have all the data, and now I'm sitting there with that. If I'm having my buildings assessed, can you talk a little bit about now, what kind of reports, what kind of assessment, what should I be getting back on my building?
Oh, sure. I think assessments need to provide value on multiple fronts. First, as we've talked about a little bit, having a standards-based approach and best practice that really assures a consistency and maintaining relevance within the industry. I mean, there's connecting back to the industry and not just a one-off approach is extremely important. Secondly, as Tom just mentioned, we need to provide an in-depth view of what we learn on site from subject matter experts, the people, typically vendors, who are running those sites to assess the systems and how they're being used and how they're set up. Another thing is we need clean inventories of what the OT systems and devices are that are on the networks. Having that knowledge, as Fred's mentioned, one of the key NIST tenets, and one of the first things we talked about is identifying what's there. That's critical to understanding what's going on inside your real estate portfolio. Also, an in-depth review of what these operational technology front-end systems are doing and how they're configured. That leans into what Tom was just mentioning about what are the users doing, how are the users set up, and are there too many users set up? Do they have too much access, and provide and increase the risk actually of how the systems are being operated from within the building, let alone the external actors that we're talking about.
So when you're doing an OT assessment, you get a report of all of those things as well. So it's
Yes.
not just the inventory.
Absolutely, we're assessing the risk of those systems and how they're set up. Also, we provide a network scan of each one of those networks, whether they're standalone networks or they're connected to a more robust network. Understanding how the OT networks and systems are architected is very important, so you can start putting together the mitigation plan, mitigation strategies. And again, to circle back to it, I think one of the most important elements is the NIST-based scoring card and summary, to provide a clear and concise, strong and weak areas for the site teams to eventually focus on, so they can address the risks that have been identified.
So, Daryl, I'm glad you brought up NIST, because I wanted to ask Fred. So, Fred, you talked about being able to have being able to distill that 1,600 and some odd pool of NIST guidances all the way down to 20. I think the number was 21 guidances that we have, and then down to the 7 areas. Can you talk a little bit about the kind of how we've done some scorecarding on that?
Sure. So first, we use 2 scoring tools. The first is BSET, which stands for the Building Cybersecurity Evaluation Tool. It's a series of questions derived from the NIST Cybersecurity Framework and years of experience in the building control space. These questions determine the level of readiness around policy, knowledge, and the current level of commitment to the cybersecurity programs, if any, the company is engaged in. The other is a site assessment, where the assessor collects information from each of the systems, both the application server and the controllers and the local networking. The things we look for are internet connectivity, remote connectivity, physical location, operating systems, application versions, and usage. And what I mean by usage, for example, on numerous occasions, we have seen the application server being used to check personal email or social media. This type of activity has directly caused the ransomware attacks that I spoke of earlier, or that we've talked about. The scoring scale we use is a simple A through F. A being excellent. That means that the cybersecurity is mature and best practices are in use. B is good, but cybersecurity is a priority and maturing. C is fair. Cybersecurity is improving, but not fully mature. D is weak. Cybersecurity is not actively utilized operationally. And F is poor. Cybersecurity is not a primary focus, nor does it exist. We typically see Ds and Fs. We've seen some Cs and even one B. We take the scores from BSET and the site assessments, and we roll them up into an overall building score. Again, in most cases, we see Ds and Fs with a few Cs here and there. Other items contained within the report are summaries of critical findings of assessments broken down by computer and software, meaning the application computer or server and how it's configured. Application and hardware, these are the controllers distributed throughout the building, and local networking and internet connectivity. In other words, are there managed or unmanaged switches? Is the system directly exposed to the internet? What is connected and how it's configured? There are many more details, but this gives you an idea of what to expect.
So Fred, I mean, we have the scorecard, and it's got. So if I'm a building owner or operator, and I get back at F, are you just telling me I'm an F, or are you telling me what I can do to become a C or a B or an A?
Absolutely. Included in the report is actually remediation guidances, if you will. Now, obviously, we can't take it down to the level of where you actually are, but we can, some very plain, disconnect from the public internet, become don't be public facing, take over the control of your users, so on and so forth. But yes, there are definite steps throughout the report to tell you what to do.
Okay. So Fred, I'm not going to let you go. We've actually gotten some questions in, and the first one I'm going to throw your way. So this person's asking, so in our assessments, we're looking at both the building systems and how they're connected to the internet. and you can tell this person knows what they're talking about. Does this include finding rogue or unknown networks in the building?
Absolutely. It includes finding rogue networks. It also includes finding rogue devices. Real quick story. Um, some of you guys may be aware that the NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab got hit, and the way it got hit was through a thing called a Raspberry Pi. It's a little kit box, if you will, that anybody can
Costs about
download.
$50. Yeah.
Yeah, about $50, and that $50 cost NASA quite a bit of embarrassment, and they lost a lot of the drawings for some of the development. So rogue devices, we've found Raspberry Pis on networks that were associated with financial group. And in that particular case, the gentleman that I was interviewing, he said, well, we really don't have much on this network. We only have 4 devices. And I said, well, I'm here to verify. So once I performed the scan, I found that there were 32 devices, including one of those Raspberry Pi. We've also found that there's been portals out to the internet that nobody knew about, like, for instance, a Cradlepoint router, which is just sitting there that somebody, maybe a vendor plugged it in, and they really didn't mean anything by it. It was to help service the network, but that is a point of entry.
Awesome. Thank you. We got a great question in from a participant. Hey, Daryl, I'm going to throw this one your way. The question is, do you have a risk scorecard to determine which assets in an entire portfolio should go through an assessment process?
Well, we actually utilize our process during discovery to really look at a company portfolio. It's actually part of the engagement process that we use to really scope out what we're going to do on site and what the tech team is going to do when they're on site. So it's less a scorecard, but more a process. But typically what we find, just to give you a typical answer, is we find that there's generally about 3 to 5 common systems in most built infrastructure. The building automation, lighting, metering, security cameras, access control, and sometimes elevator or vertical transport management systems that are common in most buildings. That if you address these common systems, you're probably going to easily hit the 80-20 rule. But when planning to help this user out, or this participant out, is you can then look at your own infrastructure and see if you have more than that. So that's typically what we do see.
Kind of a related question to that. The question is, it seems like it's a very large effort to assess all of the buildings, and the person actually put all in all caps. Why not start with just a few? So if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, customers that have exceptional and unusual inventory and knowledge would go to what I think the question's referring to, kind of a pilot approach to remediation, but that's not the paradigm for doing assessments and inventory. Really does you little good to go do a quote pilot approach to assess and inventory a small percentage of buildings. That's you're going to need to know about all the systems and all the networks, but as we said multiple times today, it's sort of an inch deep and a mile wide, right? We're just going and finding out what is there and what is your risk profile, and that needs to be done on every building. So just to stress that the whole approach is designed to be scalable in terms of affordability and to give quick information on the risk inventory and the risk profile of all the buildings.
Got it. And Matt, someone's asking here, if I find and fix all the networks and remote access issues, isn't that enough? I mean, what just gets started. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, it's no is the short answer. First of all,
Thanks,
what
Matt,
we see is you'd be surprised how many unknown or unauthorized connections you'll find, and identifying that and then changing those behaviors for remote access is not really a simple task. However, each system creates risks on their own, and things like old password or old software, no passwords, no backups, other configuration issues, those present huge risk points and really have nothing to do with remote access.
Got it. Hey, Daryl, we've gotten quite a few questions around the, I'll call it, I'm labeling this, the questions isn't necessarily the complexities of NIST. And it kind of boils down to, do they need to be experts in NIST to address the risk in the building systems?
The short answer is no, which is one of the reasons we put together the practice we have. We found as we've gone into customer sites that complexity doesn't address the OT concerns, the operational technology concerns. So again, the short answer is no. That's one of the reasons we've gotten down to the 21 guidances that are so critical, and we then further focus it into how do we help an organization manage their vendors' access and compliance with some of these new policies that need to be set up. It's really a crawl, walk, run strategy rather than trying to say everybody must do all of this cybersecurity complex solutioning. We're saying let's start at the areas that are most relevant to you in the OT space, and you will make huge impacts very early and quickly. So the short answer is no, and the long answer was what I just said.
Oh, it was a good answer, Daryl. Good answer. So awesome, guys. That's kind of the biggest pieces of the questions that we've gotten today. But before we kind of transition out, I'd love to get parting thoughts from each of you. You know, and Fred, I'll start with you. I know you've personally completed quite a few of these, a lot of these building assessments. You've been into a lot of mechanical rooms and up and down a lot of hallways. Could you give any insider pro tips as we finish up today?
Sure. I mean, cybersecurity has many facets, as we've all been talking about. And like Daryl said, it crawl, walk, run. It can be very overwhelming to address. What I would encourage anyone who is beginning this journey is to start with the basics. And those basics are take an inventory. I know we've said that over and over, but you got to identify what you have, and you got to identify the behavior that may put you at risk. Reviewing vendor policies if you have them, and if you don't, create those so that you can more manage your external risk as well.
Awesome. Daryl, you know, you as the designer of a lot of this process, and your expertise over the years, do you have any final thoughts?
As Tom and Matt have both mentioned, in fact, we all have, it's important for those who have the responsibility for the real estate portfolios to go to scale, not only with assessments, but then with mitigation across the portfolio. Tom said it early on where he mentioned, you know, have 2 billion, I think Matt mentioned it too. 1 or 2 out of 100 still have a problem. Those are what gets remembered. The 98 and the pat on the back is nice, but the 2 out of 100 that had a problem are still a problem. And those risks can propagate across a portfolio quickly. So the idea of scaling the identification and mitigation planning across a portfolio quickly is extremely important, so you can mitigate the risks that can propagate and problems that can go across your portfolio quickly.
Awesome. Mr. Ehrlich.
And that is just a encouragement to just think of not only about what you have today, but where you're going tomorrow. And what we're seeing is a lot more demands from the business on new capabilities, new services that you have to offer to tenants. And I'm afraid that sometimes there's folks who maybe have done some assessment work and some inventory work at a baseline a few years ago and think that they're covered. But with the rapid
A lot of changes.
change,
A lot of changes. Yeah.
a lot of changes going on, and I think it's I'd hate to see people remain stagnant. So just something to consider, and highly encourage you to look forward as well.
Awesome. Tom, you want to put a bow on it?
Well, yeah, at least I'd like to speak to my fellow liberal arts majors out there and just say that, you know,
Here. Yeah.
this is really not, we have, as you can tell, a lot of experts on this call and in these companies, but it's not a complicated thing to get started and cover all your buildings. I mean, this process is affordable and gives you very quick, important information at a business person level. You don't have to know algorithms and protocols. So it's really just a common sense thing to get started, and gives you lots of information, and then you can make decisions after that.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. That brings us to the end of our time today. If any, I have not been monitoring since we stopped Q&A, but if any questions came in that we did not get answered, we will definitely follow up with you individually. Just so we know when we mean it, and we got a lot of emails after our last webinar, and we hope to get them here as well to answer your questions. We all exist to help you in your business, so please don't hesitate to reach out to us directly. The team will be providing in a follow-up email to you all copies of the slides, and also replays of both webinar 1. If you weren't able to attend that first webinar, you can go back and listen to that, and then also replays will be available of this as well. So we're going to be sending out, as part of that follow-up as well, an OT cyber risk checklist or a survey that you can fill out, and we'll be providing back a score to you all. So please complete that survey, and we'll provide you with that current score. Again, thank you so much for your time, and we'll be bringing the band back together sometime here in the near future to cover some more topics around your buildings and how we can help you with that risk. So again, thanks so much, and we look forward to talking to you all again soon.